4.5 hours of negotiations in Russia-US talks on Ukraine. The Russian and US delegations initially appeared cautious when negotiating on Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, but after more than 4 hours of discussion, the two sides began to laugh and joke with each other. Senior US and Russian officials met in person in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on February 18 to discuss ways to end the war in Ukraine. This was the first high-level meeting between the two countries since the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out in February 2022, taking place after US President Donald Trump spoke by phone with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin last week. The meeting had all the characteristics of a major diplomatic event. The atmosphere was solemn but tense and suspicious of each other, AFP described. Both sides were cautious because they understood the importance of the event. The meeting between the Russian and US delegations took place at the Diriyah Palace of the Saudi royal family. Staff from the host country were present everywhere. The Russian and American flags were hung above the entrance and in the meeting room. The U.S. delegation to the talks included Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. The Russian side was represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Yuri Ushakov, a foreign policy advisor to President Putin, and Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian National Investment Fund. Mr. Dmitriev's appearance showed that Russia also wanted to raise economic issues at the meeting. The event began at 10:30 a.m. on February 18th, a little later than originally planned. Representatives from both sides sat around a large wooden table, with large white bouquets of flowers in the middle. They did not smile or shake hands, nor did they make any statements to the media before the meeting. Mr. Rubio, 53, sat across from Mr. Lavrov, 74. The two top diplomats from the US and Russia have never met in person, having only spoken by phone on February 15th. Mr. Waltz sat to the left of Mr. Rubio, opposite Mr. Ushakov. Both sides wore serious expressions. Skepticism was evident. Both sides seemed to be secretly assessing and probing each other's intentions, AFP described. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan and National Security Advisor Mossad bin Mohammed Al-Iban were the two officials representing the host country at the opening session of the talks, then left the meeting room with reporters. The talks began, with the first session lasting 2.5 hours. The two sides took a 15-minute break, and then resumed work after lunch. Mr. Dmitriev participated in the second session. The RDIF director played an important role in negotiating with Mr. Witkoff to carry out the Russia-US prisoner exchange, just before Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin spoke by phone. According to Mr. Dmitriev, in addition to the Ukraine issue, the Russian and US delegations also discussed the potential for economic cooperation and energy prices. I can say that the parties had important exchanges. Towards the end of the event, both sides made a lot of jokes. It is important that the two countries pay attention to communicating with each other in a respectful and equal manner, Mr. Dmitriev told Russian TV channel Russia 24. The jokes really helped lighten the mood. Foreign Minister Lavrov and others responded, Mr. Dmitriev added, without specifying what they said. When the meeting ended at around 3 p.m., a Kremlin aide said it was hard to say whether the positions of Russia and the US were moving closer together, and that it was too early to mention the date of the summit between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. The event did not include any representatives from Ukraine or European countries. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said he will not accept any outcome from the talks because Kiev is not present, and has postponed a planned visit to Saudi Arabia scheduled for February 19th until March. Europe has also expressed concern that President Trump has sidelined them. Jana Puglierin, a researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations, warned that the US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia could reshape European security. Europe risks being left on the sidelines, watching helplessly as the foundations of regional security collapse, Puglierin told DW. After the talks, U.S. Secretary of State Rubio said the two sides had agreed to start working on a roadmap to a peaceful solution to the conflict in Ukraine and explore the incredible opportunities that exist to cooperate with Russia, both geopolitically and economically. I believe that the conversation was very useful. We listened to each other, and I have reason to believe that the U.S. side has better understood our position, Lavrov said. Experts say the Russia-US meeting in Saudi Arabia shows that Washington has fundamentally changed its policy towards Moscow. Dmitry Suslov, a member of the Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, told RT. Emma Ashford, a researcher at the US-based Stimson Center, described it as a significant step forward in US-Russia relations. Some say that the current round of talks is unlikely to bring a breakthrough, as the US and Russia need time to adjust after years of almost no contact with each other. This is just the beginning, Qi Heng, a lecturer at the Shanghai University of Political Science and Law, told REA Novosti. Trump makes offer to Ukraine after Russia-US talks. President Donald Trump said Ukraine may have to hold new elections and stressed that leader Volodymyr Zelensky is unpopular. Mr. Trump made this comment just hours after U.S. and Russian negotiators met in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to discuss ways to end the conflict in Ukraine. This is the first meeting since Mr. Trump's predecessor, former President Joe Biden, suspended most contacts with Moscow in 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly stated that Russia no longer considers Mr. Zelensky to be the legitimate president because his 5-year presidential term ended in May 2024 and no new elections have been held due to martial law. Speaking on February 18, Mr. Trump emphasized that Mr. Zelensky is not popular at home. "I hate to say it, but the Ukrainian leader's approval rating has dropped to 4%, Trump said. Ukrainian officials have insisted that new elections are impossible while the conflict with Russia continues. Zelensky's approval rating soared to 90% in the early months of the conflict in 2022, but has since fallen to around 50% due to battlefield losses and persistent economic problems. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on February 18 that Putin was ready to negotiate with Zelensky, but only if the issue of the Ukrainian leader's controversial legitimacy was resolved. Meanwhile, President Zelensky reiterated his demand to include Kiev in any talks on ending the conflict with Russia after the United States and Russia agreed to form a negotiating team to stop the fighting. Ukraine was not represented at the talks between US and Russian officials in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on February 18. Zelensky added that he had originally planned to travel to Saudi Arabia on February 19, but had postponed his trip to Riyadh until March 10 because he did not want any coincidences. The U.S. State Department said that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov agreed to appoint their respective high-level teams to begin working to end the conflict in Ukraine as soon as possible. Washington added that the sides also agreed to establish a consultation mechanism to address issues that hinder U.S.-Russia relations, noting that they would lay the groundwork for future cooperation. Russia also made tougher demands during the meeting in Saudi Arabia. The Kremlin said Ukraine had the right to join the European Union but not the NATO military alliance.